Welcome back, guys. It's been a while, but I'm finally back to start talking about the very basics of sound design. And I'm going to start today by talking about what subtractive synthesis is. There's many different kinds of synthesis out there. There's obviously subtractive and additive, which are the main ones that I would be concerned about teaching you, but there's also stuff like wavetable synthesis and granular synthesis. For this video though, we're going to start with subtractive synthesis, as it's essentially the most simple one. The idea of subtractive synthesis is that you will have a sound to start with, and you don't really have to worry about how to make that sound, why it is that you start with that sound. You just pick a sound that's already there and made that you start with, and you edit that sound to get a new sound, which is whatever you want it to be. So obviously this is called subtractive synthesis because most of the process of making your own new sound is taking that starting sound and taking things away from it or changing it. So let's try and start with the most simple synthesizer we can. Go over to the Add tab to go and add a new synthesizer to your track, and you'll see a list of quite a few options. This list could probably be pretty intimidating for you to look at as a brand new person to sound design, but I just want you to know that in FL Studio, honestly, about 10% of this list is stuff that you're going to be using regularly. I'd say half of it is stuff that is extremely niche and narrow in its use case, and you're not going to be using that often. Half of it you might literally never use, and there's only a very small selection of synthesizers you'll probably be using very, very regularly. So don't worry about, oh god, there's so many of them, because at the end of the day, 2 or 3 of them are going to do 90% of the work that you need done. As well as that, you may be concerned, because when you look at my list of synthesizers, you might see some synthesizers you're looking at your list and not seeing, or you might be worried about the fact that my list of synthesizers is laid out in a different way. At the very bottom of the list, there's a little divider, and the bottom 3 options should be categories, simple, and tree. These aren't actually synthesizers, these are different ways you can organize the list. I personally just have it on simple. If you have it on simple, it will just have everything in one big chunk in alphabetical order. Obviously you can use whichever one of these layouts you would prefer, but I'm just saying for anyone who maybe would be a bit nervous and wants to make sure that everything looks the exact same as it does on their screen to mine, then all you have to do is click simple and it should organize them in the correct order. As for any synthesizers you're looking at here and thinking, I don't have that, don't worry. The reason why there are some here you won't have is because you can add synthesizers from outside FL Studio into it. And obviously I have some synthesizers here that I've added in. You won't have those yet, that's fine, we're not going to be talking about them yet. Anyway, conveniently, just by complete coincidence, the most simple synthesizer to use, and probably the best one to start with, is the one at the very top of the list if it's in alphabetical order. 3 times Oscillator. When you open it up, it should look like this. And what this is just what it says. 3 oscillators. But before you can figure out what an oscillator is, it would probably be easier if we could only hear one of the oscillators at a time. However, by default, when you first open up 3 times oscillator, all 3 oscillators will be turned on. You might notice that the knobs and images kind of repeat themselves, so you can tell these are all the different settings for each oscillator, but you might notice that both the second and third one have an extra knob. This knob that controls their mix, which is just kind of what it sounds like, how much they are mixed in with the first one. If you turn them all the way to the left, it'll set them both to 0% and you won't be able to hear them anymore. That way, you'll only hear the first oscillator and it'll be a little bit easier to explain what they're all about. So now that we can more clearly hear one oscillator at a time, what is an oscillator? Essentially, you've probably seen sound waves before, even if you don't fully understand what's going on with them. Well, the proper name for the actual graphic here showing the sound waves is an oscilloscope, and essentially it measures volume over time. Now that might seem a little bit strange to you, because you might notice that the middle of the graph is 0 decibels, as in no volume, whereas up and down are both when there is volume, which seems a little strange. Surely there's just more volume or less volume, why does it need to go up and down? Well, this might sound quite strange to you, but remember that essentially sound is just motion that your ears pick up. And obviously you can have movements in one direction or another. Essentially the reason it goes both up and down is you can have, in a way of speaking, positive and negative volumes or amplitudes or whatever you want to call them. And they don't sound any different, but you can essentially think of them like it's still motion, but it's motion in different directions. All that means is both directions will sound the exact same, but if you try to push it both up and down at the same time, they will both cancel each other out and just get close to the middle. That's a concept we're going to get back to more later, so don't worry if you found that a little bit confusing. The reason I bring up the oscilloscope is because an oscillator will essentially make a sound that makes a shape on a oscilloscope. That shape could be a sine wave, this curved kind of wave, or it could be a square wave, just what you think it is, this nice kind of square shape. But you might be wondering about something. If you look at an oscilloscope, yes, it will measure volume, but does it measure pitch? Because surely that seems like the two things that is measurable about sounds, is that you can measure how loud they are, and you can measure what their pitch is. Well, this is another thing that's a little bit unintuitive when you don't think about music electronically, but makes much more sense when you think of it in this new way. Another way of talking about pitch is frequency. And the reason why we say pitch or frequency is because frequency literally means how often something happens. And it turns out that the pitch of a sound is dictated by how many times a second it makes that same shape on the oscilloscope. So you can tell that when I play a higher pitched sound on the oscilloscope, you're going to see more repeating images of that same shape, because more of them can fit in a smaller space of time. The frequency has increased. Whereas when it's a lower frequency, you'll see less of these shapes, because it takes longer for this shape to repeat. Now if you're still following, then that's great, because that's probably the most confusing part about this whole synthesizer to get your head around. It is quite a nice and basic one to start with. So let's start talking about these buttons and knobs. Of course we're only going to be focusing on the top third of it for now, because of course the other two are for the other two oscillators we've already turned off. So the only thing that will change anything are the ones to the right of the little one. First of all, and probably most noticeably, is the series of little icons on the left side. As you could probably guess, these are the different wave shapes you can select for your oscillator in 3x oscillator. You have the standard ones that most oscillators will be capable of doing: a sine wave, a triangle wave, a square wave, and a saw wave. You also have a rounded saw wave, which is a bit more strange, but definitely has a nice sound to it. And then you have three slightly more unique buttons, those being the randomize button, which isn't quite what you might expect. Yes, it does produce a random wave shape, but because the chances of that random wave shape sounding harmonic are so low, this will generally just randomly generate noise, as in that kind of hissing sound. Obviously you can tell this doesn't have much of a real pitch to it, so this is mostly used as a sound effect, or mixed in with a pitch sound with some other effects to give it some extra grittiness to it. There's this strange sort of wavy icon on the There's this strange wavy icon on the right, which allows you to select a sound file and turn it into a wave shape that you can play on the oscillator. It certainly has mixed results. It doesn't just play the sound back perfectly. It tries to convert whatever sound you gave it into a wave shape, which sometimes leads to weird results. And the final option is the invert mode. You can select this with another wave shape, and it will make it so whenever that wave shape would go up, it instead goes down, and of course vice versa. Whenever it would go down, it goes up. This shouldn't change the way it sounds, generally, because I mentioned before that it doesn't matter whether the wave goes up or down, it will sound the same. It just might help in some extremely niche situations where you have another sound playing at the same time, which might clash with it if they are not both going down or up at the same time, like synchronized with each other. In the middle, you can see two bars. However, I think I want to cover these last because it gets a little bit complicated when we talk about those. So let's instead talk about the three knobs at the right. The first two of them, the coarse and fine knob, will both change the pitch of the sound. The coarse knob will change it by semitones, and the fine knob will change it by cent tones. Semitones, kind of unintuitively, are the difference in pitch between two notes that are one space apart. You might have thought it was half a space because they're called semitones, but no, it's one full space. And of course, cent tones, there are 100 cent tones in one semitone. So if you move something up by 1 cent tone, that's 1/100th of a note. You might also notice that the coarse knob has a bigger notch on it every 12 notches. That's because 12 semitones is equal to 1 entire octave. So if you moved the sound down 12 semitones, then you would just be pitching it down an octave. As we covered before, that would perfectly halve the frequency of the sound, and moving it up by 12 would perfectly double it. To be completely honest, there's basically no point to ever using the coarse knob to change the semitone amount by anything that isn't a multiple of 12. The reason why is you can already play whatever note you want on this thing, so why would you make it not a multiple of 12? It would just make it confusing to use. Because for example, if you had it set so that the coarse was at 25, you would always be playing the note above the one you press. For example, if you press the C key, you'd be playing C sharp. Of course, if you wanted to play C sharp, you could just press the C sharp key instead. So yes, I would generally say just keep the coarse knob at a multiple of 12, whichever one sounds like the right sort of frequency. If it's too high pitched, just bring it down by 12. If it's too low pitched, just bring it up by 12. You might have thought for the same reason that I would expect the fine-tuning knob to be pretty useless as well, since it changes by hundredths of a note, which would also mess up your frequency relationships a little bit. But the change with the fine-tuning, as you can imagine, is so subtle that it doesn't tend to mess with the pitching of sounds too badly, and sometimes it can create some really interesting effects if sounds are very close in pitch but just barely desynchronized. So the fine knob I actually do think is decent to mess around with. Finally, to the right of that is the panning knob. Of course, if you've got a set of headphones, you've got two ears on there. If you turn it to the left, the sound will only come out the left ear. If you turn it to the right, it will only come out the right ear. One last strange sort of quirk of 3x oscillator to note is that, weirdly enough, when you play a note on it, it will actually be, by default, a whole scale higher than the note you pressed. For example, right now, if I press C5, the note we're hearing is actually C6. That's because 12 on the coarse pitch is no pitch change. And of course, the first oscillator is set to 24 by default when you first open it. So yeah, if you want to make sure that the note you're playing is absolutely the pitch that comes out, make sure to set your oscillator to 12 coarse. Which just leaves us with the two bars we skipped earlier in the middle. Stereo phase offset and stereo detune. You might have been able to guess by the fact they both use the word stereo that they are both to do with the left and right ears. However, they both do things a little bit more complicated than the panning knob from earlier, which just put it in one ear or the other. Stereo phase offset is probably the more tough one to explain, because they have to explain what phase is. Its meaning can differ slightly depending on the context, but generally what we talk about when we talk about phase in sound design is usually the position from which a sound wave begins its oscillation. So to put that more simply, take a look at this sine wave again. Now in this image, it starts from the middle going up and ends in the middle, having gone up before it reached the middle. Now technically, if we started from halfway through, going down first and then up instead of up then down, it would still be a sine wave, wouldn't it? You just would have started from halfway through. So we would say that is a sine wave with a phase of 180 degrees, because 360 degrees means the whole length of the entire sound wave before it starts repeating the same shape. There's nothing saying we couldn't have a sine wave with a phase of 90 degrees, which actually starts and ends at the top, going down and then up. So what the stereo phase offset knob will do is increase the amount the phase of your sound waves can change depending on where they are, like further to the left or right in your ears. Now that might sound a little bit strange. You'd think that would be such a hard to notice effect that it wouldn't be worth it. However, you'll be able to hear for yourself the effect this creates. Essentially, you might have noticed when listening to music sometimes with headphones, even though there's only a left and right ear, still sometimes some sounds sound like they're dead in front of you, and yet some sounds sound like they're surrounding you, all around your head. When there's more subtle differences between the left and right ear, even though it's clear they're generally playing the same sound, you have this kind of surrounding effect around your head. And when both the left and right ear seem almost perfectly synchronized, that's when it sounds like it's dead in front of you. So by increasing the amount of stereo phase offset, you create more of this kind of surrounding effect. It becomes more noticeable when you turn up this knob at the bottom here, the phase randomness, which affects all phase offsets for all three oscillators. This will of course randomize your stereo phase offset amounts. The other bar, the stereo detune, does a similar job in a slightly different way. It can affect the pitch of the sound, again, subtly in cent tones, depending on how far to the left or right it is. And that's everything in 3x Oscillator, except this little button here to set Oscillator 3 to be an Amplitude Modulator, but, well, you don't have to worry about that really. I will give you the short explanation of what this is, but Amplitude Modulators aren't very common from what I've seen, so you don't have to worry about them that often. So if you don't understand this, don't worry. If it ever becomes important later, I'll bring it back up, but you probably won't need to have to go out of your way to learn how Amplitude Modulation works. Essentially though, the short version, if you can understand just from this, is that turning this on will make it so instead of Oscillator 3 putting out an actual volume and being audible, instead what it will do is it will take its wave shape and use it to change the volumes of Oscillator 1 at certain times depending on which part of the wave would be played if you could hear Oscillator 3. So obviously that means at a point at which Oscillator 3 would be louder, it turns up the volume of Oscillator 1. Even though you can't hear Oscillator 3, you can change the volume of Oscillator 1 using the values inside Oscillator 3. And of course, when it's lower, it would turn down the volume of Oscillator 1. But again, if you didn't quite follow that, do not worry, we can get back to it later if we need to. So there you go. That's everything you need to know about 3x Oscillator. And it might seem a little daunting now because you're thinking, wow, that was only one synthesizer, and that was the most simple one as well, and there's all these other ones. Don't worry though. You'll notice that a lot of synthesizers use the same techniques and ideas that previous ones you've already learned do. So with every new synthesizer you learn, the next one becomes easier to learn. It was pretty clear that 3x Oscillator was the best one to start with, but from here it gets a little bit more muddy, which is the next best synthesizer to move to after you've learned how 3x Oscillator works. It's debatable, but I would say the next best one for you to take a look at is GMS, or Groove Machine Synthesizer. Now I'll fully admit, I might be a little bit biased here. This was the first synth in FL Studio that I really stuck with. Back when I was really bad and had no idea what was going on, I was opening all these synths not having any idea what to do, and this was like the first synth I opened up and started to actually understand some of what I was doing. I really have a soft spot for this synth, and I hope that you'll learn to enjoy it too. And of course, it is a subtractive synthesizer.